We are finally getting to the end of this long list of modifications. Well, not really the end, it's more of the first pass through this long list of modifications. Regardless, that brings us on to parts D34 and 36 that form the radar hood. Of these two parts, it's part D34 that needs to be modified. This section that sticks out of the side here needs to be removed. The reason why it was molded like this is because of an optical illusion. There was actually a box that steps out of the roof and not a box that steps out of the side of the structure. This structure, at least on these sides, should be symmetrical. So I need to cut off this box, smooth out this curve at the back, build a little box over here on the roof, then attach D34 to part D36. Unsurprisingly, the first step is to remove this box.
I think the best way to remove the box is to shave it down using my hobby knife. I don't need to saw it off because I don't need to retain any of this plastic. And if I use the clippers, I'm concerned that it will pinch the plastic and distress the plastic that I want to keep. Once I've cut off enough of the protrusion, I then move on to a bar file to remove the rest of the excess plastic. The rear wall of the radar hood is slightly curved, and I need to now replicate that curve on this side. The easiest way to do this is to just do it by eye. If I go slowly and frequently check the curve, it's not something that's going to be too difficult to do. I just need to be careful not to remove too much accidentally. So over the course of the next few minutes, I gently work this curve into the wall. By the time I've finished shaping this wall, I have opened up a hole where the protrusion used to be. This now needs to be filled. The hole is roughly 2 millimeters wide, and I have 2 millimeter styrene stock, so I cut off a section and glue it in place using thick plastic cement. This plastic cement does take quite a long time to dry, so I set aside the part for quite a while before it's ready to be handled. Once it is ready to be handled, I apply a thin layer of plastic putty. And I then wait for the plastic putty to dry. Once the putty is dried, I'm then able to file it off and sand the surface smooth. Now that the top section of the radar hood has been corrected, it can be glued to the lower section. I glue these parts together using extra thin plastic cement. Fortunately, this plastic cement does set very quickly, so I'm able to move almost immediately onto filling the gaps with more plastic putty. And then once that putty is applied, I then have to wait yet again for the putty to dry. This is quite a frustrating component to build, not because it's complex, but rather because there are a lot of sequential steps that just take a long time to complete, simply because the glue or the putty has to dry before you can move on to the next step. So although it doesn't look like this takes a long time to build because of editing, obviously, this component took quite a long time to build. Now that the putty is dried, I'm able to sand it off. I use the file to shape the sides, and I use a piece of flat sandpaper to clean up the roof. The holes that are in the roof of the radar hood aren't going to be used. Those holes are for the base of the plastic radar. The provided plastic radar is going to be replaced with photo etch, so those aren't needed, so I can just fill them. There was also a seam line on the top of the roof, and the components weren't exactly at the same height. So the sanding will help even all of that out and create a nice flat roof. Now that I have a roof that's in a good condition, I can move on to making the box that goes on top of the roof. I'm not exactly sure about how big this box should be. I've looked at images in World of Warships and some images that I found online, but it's not so easy to tell how big it should be. So I'm just going to give it my best guess. I think a height of 0.5 millimeters will be appropriate. So I cut sections of 0.5 millimeter styrene stock and start building the outline of the box on the roof. Initially, I was going to cut these pieces using the chopper, probably because it's a new toy for me and I seem to try and find a place to use it whenever I can. But I quickly realized that that was actually a mistake. For this kind of work, using the chopper is not actually going to help. There isn't really a need to precision cut components, and all of these components are going to be of a different length because this box isn't square. It has at least that curved section on the back of it. So what I realized is that the only corner that I need to get right is the one that's going to be in the middle of the roof. All the other edges can be cut roughly and then sanded to the correct length. So that's how I then proceed. After gluing down the first strip with a bit overhanging the edge, I then cut another strip to a rough length and glue it down. The final two sections then just need to follow the perimeter of the radar hood. After gluing down the two edges of the box that go on the inner section of the roof, I then glue down the curved section that goes around the rear perimeter. Once the edges are sufficiently dry, I then clip them to length. That now just leaves one edge left to fill. That I just fill by cutting back a piece of the styrene stock and test fitting until I get it to the appropriate length. And then I glue it in place using extra thin plastic cement. Now I need to decide how I'm going to fill this box. I think it would actually be quite difficult to make a lid out of styrene stock and then cut it perfectly and glue it in place. So what I'm going to do is just fill it with extra thick super glue and then sand the top level. I think that's going to be by far the easiest way to do this. Since the box actually is quite big, I'm able to directly place the extra thick super glue into the box. I haven't showed it, but I did need to top up the glue a bit. When the super glue sets, it does lower a bit. So there was a slight dip in the glue at the surface of this box. Just a little bit more extra thick super glue filled it up very nicely. Once the glue had hardened, I then moved on to finishing the edges. This was simple to do, I just filed them smooth. I then surfaced the top of the super glue filled box with plastic putty so I could then sand it down to create a smooth finish. I sanded it smooth using a sheet of 400 grit sandpaper. There is one more detail that I need to add to this box. There's a circle that needs to go in the center of it. It's a very small circle. It's not something that I'm going to be able to punch out or cut out, so I need to find an appropriate sized piece of photo etch. I looked back through my stash of photo etch and I found some cable spools. And for whatever reason, this cable spool had already one of its sides cut off, so I decided I'd salvage the other end. In this case, the detailed surface I'm going to glue face down because I don't want any of that detail. I want it to have a smooth surface. And the other problem with this cable spool is it has these holes through it. So I glue it in place using extra thin super glue and then place a drop of extra thick super glue on top of it so that it can seep into those holes. Once the super glue drop on top of the photo etch has dried, I then file it flat. The radar hood is then painted in XF53, the color for hood's superstructure. I'm watching this video while I'm narrating it, and at this point I realized I probably should have sprayed this in Surfacer first. But I did do quite a good job of it, and the surface is quite good. It doesn't actually need Surfacer, so it's no real issue here. I'll just leave it as is. That concludes my first pass through the forward superstructure. I'll now return to the base of the superstructure and start working up again. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.